Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar, Preparing Your Organisation for NIS2 Compliance. Just before I pass over to MJ and Mike, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded. A copy of the recording and all the slides that we cover will be sent to everyone after this. We also have a Q&A, and we want kind of the end part of this webinar to be more of an open Q&A, fairly informal, answering any questions you have. So please do pop your questions into the chat box throughout as they're going through the slides, and we'll get to those at the end. Brilliant. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar around NIS2. We'll also be covering off some of the changes to UK NIS1. And the idea is just to give you an overview of NIS2, why it's happening, what the changes are, and what you should actually be doing to get yourselves ready for it, and whether or not you're in scope for NIS2. My name is Mark Jones, and I'm the head of cybersecurity at Chorus. I've worked at Chorus for about 9 years, and I've been head of cybersecurity for almost 3 now. And in that time, obviously, we've seen our cybersecurity team grow. We offer managed security services, and we offer professional services, and we get to see companies being attacked every day, and we get to help companies recover from attacks. And we also help organizations improve their security posture and get them to places where they need to be to meet requirements like this. And I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Mike Barton, who is our lead cybersecurity consultant. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself?
How you do? Yeah, good to meet you all today. We're just going to be talking, as MJ said, we're going to be talking about the NIS2 elements, and I can go into a little bit more in depth about the different sections and the different requirements that we're going to hit and we're going to meet. I do have quite a bit of a background, having gone through this journey with a number of power stations in a previous life. So any questions, very welcome to just reach out. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, great. And like we say, we really encourage any questions. Try and stump us if you can. So a quick slide about Chorus. We are an MSSP, or a managed security services provider. We have a UK-based 24/7 CSOC. We now have over 20 technical staff, I think, and we basically operate around the clock, providing MXDR solutions, so managed extended detection response and managed detect and response services. We are members of the Microsoft Intelligent Security Association, or MISA, and we also have had our MXDR solutions verified. So the key part of those MXDR services is the fact that we take response actions. So all of our services basically allow us to take response actions in customers' environments, and it allows us to quick technical changes. All of our services allow us to take response actions, which basically means if we see threats in customers' environments, we can take some kind of containment action, some response action, and kind of shut things down before they turn into major breaches or data loss or data exfiltration for your business. So let's kind of frame the conversation a bit. Let's talk about the background for this in the landscape. And we see a lot of changes. And just to highlight some of them, we have here 1 hour and 12 minutes is the average time for an attacker to access your private data if you fall victim to a phishing email. 9.6% of ransomware incidents are taking place during daytime working hours, which means obviously over 90% of ransomware happens outside of working hours. So attackers know when you're working, they know when you're best placed to defend your business and to take quick action, and they're deliberately targeting you when they think that you'll be weak. And we see Friday late night being the most common time for a cyber attack, which again is trying to hit you when you're weak and when you're not paying attention and when you don't have the coverage. And I think really the thing we need to talk about here is the timescales involved in these attacks. We used to talk just a couple of years ago about attacker dwell times being 180 days, and then they went down to 90 days. And really, I think and I'm sure Mike can speak to this too, a lot of the attacks we see nowadays are very automated, they're very quick, and we see the times being very, very short. If an attack is successful and someone gains initial access, they can very, very quickly fulfill the objectives or reach data that you wouldn't want them to reach, and exfiltrate company data. And timings become everything, right? Which is why in our MXDR services, the timing is probably the most important thing we have. Across all of our customers, in the last month, our mean time to acknowledge was about 5 minutes, and our mean time to close was about 20 minutes. And it needs to be to stay ahead of attackers.
Yeah, it's our ability to respond, really, and that's the 6% of the organisations these days are going to be doing that managed detect and response, and that's what we're really, really good at.
Yeah.
It's that response, and getting eyes on the logs and the sources, and doing that proactive investigation as we see it.
Yeah, brilliant. And so let's talk about how do we frame this conversation again. So we've kind of talked about the cyber landscape and the timings. We see attacks increase in severity. We see attacks increase in frequency, and we see those times come down. And we talk about how do we reduce cyber risk. We like to frame the conversation around like this big bang event. You know, in the middle you have a breach, right? And we need to kind of approach both sides of that. So we have kind of prevent. What can we do to improve our security posture to make it harder to be breached? What can we do to lessen the impact if we are breached? We talk about like network segmentation and things like that. How do we contain a breach so that it doesn't lead to our entire organization's infrastructure being compromised? And then we have obviously the breach or the big bang event. And then we have right of that. So how do we respond? How do we detect that? How do we rapidly respond to that and contain it to mitigate that threat and to manage that attack and that major incident?
It's key. It's the key as well, is that visibility element. And this is where the identify process was part of that. And then doing your risk assessment on all of your assets is really key, because you need to understand exactly what you have and how you're going to protect it in order to then understand how to detect and respond against it. And that's a huge key to this, which is that process, which is asset management side of things.
Yeah, and this actually really neatly corresponds to like the NIS2 objectives and the principles, which we'll go into a bit later. But I kind of follow this. The framework follows a similar perspective of you need to put a lot of time and attention into both prevent and respond. Make sure everyone in your business knows what to do if the worst happens, and make sure you're doing all the right things to prevent that from happening. So what is NIS2? NIS2 is a European cybersecurity directive that will replace NIS1. In the UK, I think since 2018, we've been subject to NIS1, and NIS2 is really a European-aimed legislation that's going to be picked up by all member states into law by 17th of October 2024. So very soon, every member of the European Union will have to put this into law. They'll also have to appoint one or more competent authorities that are going to be responsible for enforcing the directive in a country. So it's something that will be audited, that each member state will have the ability to chase up organizations in scope and make sure they're doing the right things. It's also really comprehensive. So we've increased the amount of sectors and businesses and verticals that are covered by the NIS2 directive. And it basically aims to improve the collective cybersecurity posture of the entire European Union.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, we talk about that in NIS1 and how it was applied to a lot of the operational essential services, the critical national infrastructure. So anything from your energy sector to the water, all the facilities and stuff like that. Then the idea was to increase that cybersecurity level, so it was at a standard across the board, which meant that if any attack, it wouldn't then damage the UK as such, because it's affected all those power stations and those those critical national infrastructure. So the thing is with NIS1, how it's expanded into NIS2 is because there's other sectors now, isn't there really? And there'll be in a short while we'll talk about that. But those cyber attacks are not just happening on the CNI, the OESs, they're happening everywhere. They're happening from MSPs. These companies that are looking after your IT, they're gold because we've got them that privileged access into other people's companies. And if they get a foothold with us, they'll get foothold with an MSP. They're going to take advantage of the customers, and that's become very pressing. The financial markets as well has been a big one, hasn't it? I think, and then that's been. So it's not just about the CNI and OES, but everything now in terms of the EU and all the sectors. So the reason why it's expanding is so we can actually, as Europe, is actually going to be at a better security level to tackle those threat actors. For the landscape.
That's a really good point, actually, Mike. So we talk about you mentioned CNI, so critical national infrastructure. You talk about OES, or operators of essential services, and we're talking about like what is NIS1, NIS2. They're basically like the minimum requirements for cybersecurity for critical national infrastructure and operators of essential services, right? So is the difference between NIS1 and NIS2 a change in that minimum standard, or is it just a change to who's in scope for that standard?
I think it's both, actually. I mean, in terms of not taking the same baseline level and applying to all these different sectors, but you've probably got you have got additional supply chain requirements and stuff like that, as well as a number of the I've just forgotten quite a number of the protection elements as well, and identity management as well, and it's using more robust and certificates like RSA keys and stuff like that as well, which FIDO2 keys and stuff like that. That's going into the more of the protection element as well, and of course the response side as well, which we'll talk about, which is a section where it's all about that incident response. How do you detect an incident? How do you respond? How is that filtered in? NIS1 was quite heavy into that, but NIS2 has some additional requirements which have enforced better security standards.
Great, yeah. So it's both, isn't it? It's more companies, more organizations, more verticals are in scope for the NIS directive in NIS2. And there's going to be some additional requirements above NIS1. In the UK, we're sticking with NIS1. I think it's going to turn into what we're calling UK NIS1. And Mike already mentioned managed service providers like Chorus, in fact, and other people who provide outsourced IT, things like that. They're going to come in scope for UK NIS1. UK NIS1 is actually changing a little bit. So obviously they're bringing other people into scope, and they're also bringing in some new requirements about supply chain, some new requirements about incident reporting, what's in scope, how frequently things should be reported, those kinds of things.
Very good point. You just mentioned about the reporting frequency as well. That's also changed, hasn't it? And
yes.
Because originally it was 72 hours, similar to the GDPR and reach with the ICO. And what is it now, 24?
Yeah, 24 early warning, 72 for proper incident report, and then you have like a month, I think, for the full analysis, full report. Yeah. So yeah, again, early warning's been introduced. So yeah, it's this collective. Let's improve the minimum cybersecurity for all the critical stuff in our member states, and collectively, let's improve the cybersecurity of the European Union, basically. And the UK obviously sits outside the European Union. And they're going to stick with NIS1, although they've changed the law to make it easier for them to change NIS1. So we might see some more changes to UK NIS1. And actually, the changes that I was just talking about haven't really come into law just yet, although they've been approved to come into law. So we'll see when that happens. So we've got the cyber landscape changing. Attacks are becoming more frequent, more sophisticated. They've seen a need to improve the cybersecurity across everyone, basically, and NIS2 is seen as a way to do that. If we jump onto the next slide. Move to the next slide.
I mean, what's quite what I would say is quite interesting is that if NIS1 hasn't applied or says it's not been applied to UK, how many of your customers or how many of the data centers or how many of the other elements are actually going to need to be complied by the EU? So NIS2 is going to be then applying to these customers, and if we're dealing then with those customers and we're having to do all those elements, we're then needing to be NIS2 compliant. So I mean, the safe way to do any of this, really, to understand exactly where you're needing to go, is going to be making sure that you're compliant with NIS2.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the businesses you work with, if you're working with businesses that are subject to NIS2, then it's not going to be long before we see tenders and supplier requests asking for you to prove it, even if you're not technically, as a UK-based company, in scope for those requirements. You'll see, it will affect everyone. There'll be a knock-on effect. So, who is impacted? What are the changes? So, previously with NIS1, the member states could point out who they thought were operators of essential services. They had the choice of who was in scope for NIS1. That's no longer the case. NIS2 affects all entities that provide essential or important services to the European economy. So we have this idea of essential entities and important entities. So essential entities are obviously the bigger ones. Most of the time, your critical national infrastructure or really, really important, sensitive operators of essential services. And we have important entities. So who's in scope? If you're in these sectors and you have basically 250 employees or over 50 employees or over 10 million euro turnover annually, then you'll be in scope for NIS2, essentially.
Yeah, well done.
And then just really quickly, the ones that you can still see highlighted are customers we work with, of course. So we have customers that we manage the security for 24/7 in most of those sectors.
So where would you start? Where do you start if you're trying to become NIS2 compliant and you have to you have to meet these requirements? Where do you start? How do you start it?
Well, I think you have to understand NIS2 and the requirements, and you have to understand where you sit currently against that framework.
And as we see the NIS2 principles on here, we're talking about the governance as well. So if we were to look at A1, 2, 3, and 4, we're looking about the governance side of things, aren't we? We're looking, and what we're talking about there is your ISMS. We're talking about your policies. We're talking about your risk management committee. What's your change management process? Do you keep minutes? Of making sure. So it's very much in line with the NIST framework and also the ISO 27001. It's just giving you this baseline. Asset management. We talked about briefly about just before about how do we identify, how do we understand what we need to protect if we can't see it. So it's making sure you've got all your assets. It's making sure that you can visually see, you've got monitoring of those assets. But we'll talk about that on the section. But this is all to do about your risk management, change management, your asset management. Also, it ties in with vulnerabilities as well, and vulnerability management. But this is your ISMS. So this is your documented policies and signed off by the board or senior management team. One big thing about this is and that's always been a bit of a problem previously, was supply chain. How do you then make sure that your supply chain is risk-free, which is technically impossible? How do you do it? Are you then going to be doing questionnaires and you're going to be checking the customer or your manufacturing place or whatever for your ISO qualifications and everything else? Or are you going to then sign up to an assurance framework, for example? Who does that work for you? And that's really, when we're talking about managing that security risk, we're talking about making sure that everything under the supply chain is protected, and we understand that as well.
Yeah,
because that's a big risk, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, definitely, yeah. And it's not really a technology, is it? We're not talking about there's a technology fix for some of these things. a lot of them, and we're talking about managing security risk, is policies and processes.
So technology, people, process, what we're focusing on here, and that's people and process, isn't it?
Yes.
And that is that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if we move on to protecting against cyber attack.
Yeah, well, we're talking about here now, these are your individual policies that will then support your government's ISMS pack. This is how do you do your technical changes? How do you do your vulnerability assessments? How does that then feed into the asset management piece? So these are all those individual policies and processes with each of the departments as well, and making sure that everyone is doing what they say they should be doing. And of course, these policies are always signed off and then approved by the board. And when you've got that, that means that the board understand exactly what cyber risk is and where the risks are. Let's say, look, identity and access control. We're looking at privileged identity management. Making sure that we haven't got, we've got separate admin accounts, of course, making sure we haven't got a separate admin account which has high privilege permissions the entire time. It's making sure that we've got least privileges as well. And during the onboarding process, when we do through the SOC and stuff like that as well, we're already doing least privilege. We're already making sure that, and we're making sure we're doing multi-factor authentication policies. And we're making sure everyone applies that, because you need to identify, you need to check to make sure that you are who you say you are.
Yeah.
And that's a big factor, isn't it, really? Let's face it, identity control.
And it's also the frequency of how often you do that, right? It's introducing requirements for how often do I need to go through these systems and check that the level of privilege users have is correct and still appropriate. It's also introducing those hygiene points, right?
Yeah.
So if we talk about A is managed security risk, B is obviously protecting against cyber attack. And you remember back to that Big Bang slide where we had kind of like left of Bang, which is kind of like your security posture and what you do to prepare, and then right of Bang is how you respond. We kind of have the next two objectives of detecting cybersecurity incidents and minimizing the impact of cybersecurity incidents as our kind of respond, if you will, and kind of lessons learned afterwards. And do you want to kind of introduce those topics?
I mean, the security monitoring, it's making sure that you are monitoring all those elements in your system, all of your endpoints, all of the users. You're measuring not just your users, the cloud coverage side of things, but also your on-premise or your separate directories and stuff like that. We as part of the core service as well, this is where we focus on, don't we? An awful lot is understanding what we need to cover, how we need to cover it. But the requirements for this principle is to make sure that you've got the skilled staff to do it. You have got, and you've then got also the tabletop exercises. You are looking at proactively threat hunting exercises as well. You're continually changing, you're moving to release an analytical rule to detect a threat. As soon as that's released, it's instantly out. We're constantly working in the background, making sure that those changes always get updated, and that's where it's part of that security monitoring. So we're looking at sticking all of those logs into a central login server and making sure that those logs are secure, and analysts are able to look at those logs. Your proactive security event discovery is then having a look at all of those logs, looking at all those threat challenging feeds that we do. Bringing all those MESA feeds, bringing all the CTI feeds from all these other areas as well, and taxi and everything else. And what we do is we then correlate that to see how we can threat hunt. Can we spot an active threat? And that's that proactive security event discovery. But here with the big key about this as well in section D, after we've done all of that, is how do we respond? The services MXDR, MDR, it's got the R. The R is all about the response, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that initial first line of response. How do we respond? How do we isolate? How do we minimize that threat? And how do we then prevent them laterally moving as well? And of course, this ties into your business continuity plan as well, which ties into the governance element. It ties into, so not just your business continuity plan, your incident response plan ties into that, and making sure who's dealing with those incident response plans and who their roles and responsibilities are. So we talk about the RACI matrix. again feeds back into the governance element. And lessons learned, how do we learn? How do we improve? You know,
black box exercises, right? We've got to go through the wreckage and see what we could have done better.
It is, and you know, it's going through the ticket, we're going through that entire chain of custody of that incident, really, and looking at what's happened, who's done what. So it's not just looking about the technical efficiencies, but it's talking about the process efficiencies. Could we do it quicker? It's talking about the skills and the level, and perhaps so, if we do that, maybe that leads into a training course that we have to then provide with the analysts in order to then better detect that in the future or whatever. Lessons learned is not just about the technical.
Yeah, it might also feed into the policies, right?
Yeah,
you know, a breach might happen, and you might go through lessons learned at the end of it and decide you're going to change the policy to stop that happening again in the future. So this really closely follows like that NIST framework, right? So we have kind of managing security risk, and we're talking about you know, the whole processes and procedures. We've got our actual measures we have, and the process around keeping those up to date in protecting against cyber attacks. We've obviously got monitoring and detecting cybersecurity incidents, and with C2 and proactive security event discovery, we're talking about threat hunting, making sure you're doing threat hunting, make sure maybe you're doing adversary simulation, make sure you're coming up with ways to consistently find things that you maybe don't have detections for, and then making sure you're prepared for a major incident, right? Make sure everyone knows their responsibility when it happens.
Yeah.
Make sure you're able to recover, that you test those things to make sure they're fit for purpose, right?
Goes from tabletop exercise going through to dry runs. Let's follow this business continuity plan, this disaster recovery plan, this incident response plan. Who do we communicate to? How do we do it? You know, from a paper exercise simulation to actually a full-blown simulation. It's key.
Yeah, brilliant. So what does NIS2 mean for organizations? What are the change? What does it introduce if you find yourself in scope?
Well, as we talked about that governance section of the section A, really, we're talking about policy, procedure. We're talking about risk management. You need a risk management committee.
Yeah.
You do need a change board. You need to be introducing changes in the organisation securely. So have you done a vulnerability assessment before the change or after the change to see that you haven't introduced additional risks? How do we look at the vulnerabilities? How do we handle that? So does that feed into a decent patching plan, which is with the IT, and making sure that those updates are applied effectively? Anything from the supply chain security as well. I mean, it's risk management and asset management and supply chain management are very much key in that particular point.
Right.
The instant reporting obligations, like we said before, not within 72 hours anymore, is it?
Well, within 24 hours is the early warning, right?
Yes.
And I think the other thing with the instant reporting is that there's a change in what's reported. So a big part of the changes is that they want more things reported. And this affects UK NIS1 in terms of their changing the reporting obligations there if you're a UK-based business. And then the same thing in NIS2. It's more things are in scope for being reported. It's not just I've been breached, it's things that have the potential to lead to breaches or to lead to data loss or the exposure of some of your customers will require reporting, and there's stricter requirements around when that's reported. So there's like the early warning within 24 hours, and there's the 72 hours which kind of currently exists at the moment, although there'll be more things that will be reported, and then within 1 month there'll be the final report.
And it's one thing to really touch base on as well. We talked about identity, we talked about systems. Well, we did briefly system security, making sure everything's covered. But we're talking about that training and awareness as well. Throughout your company. So what does NIS2 mean? It means that cybersecurity culture, making sure it's being pushed down from top to the bottom, really, making sure that the board are understanding and supporting that within the company, but also that phishing campaigns. Where you're training the awareness of the user base and increasing their cybersecurity knowledge and introducing them to latest threats in a safe manner. That's key as well, because ultimately that ends up protecting your data, as well, which is your emails and all your data and everything else. So it's training and awareness is key. And I think that's one of the big things as well.
Yeah, great. So management can be held accountable. I think we talked about why are more people going to pay attention to NIS2 than NIS1. One of the ways they've done this is making the implications for not being compliant much more strict. So there's going to be pretty huge fines. So if you're an essential entity, you're like a bigger business or a critical national infrastructure, that was the 250 or more employees, then you can be fined up to 10 million euros or 2% of global annual turnover. If you're an important entity, which is the kind of 50 plus employees, less important sectors, then it can be up to 7 million euros or 1.4% of your global annual turnover. And really interestingly, to make people take this seriously, management can be held responsible for non-compliance with these obligations. So we talked about the directive mandates that each member state is going to appoint a competent authority to be responsible for enforcing all the requirements of the directive. If you're not compliant with NIS2 and you're found to be not compliant by one of these competent authorities in your country, then your upper management can be held accountable. That can be a ban on exercising managerial responsibilities. That could even be, financial implications to the upper management. So when we talk about, cybersecurity culture and making changes and getting the business to listen, I think this will really help.
It is, yeah. The ultimate risk holder is the CEO, the C-suite. They are the risk holders, so they can choose to accept a risk, ignore a risk, or make or help mitigate or even transfer the risk if you talk about insurance and stuff. So, ultimately, 100%.
And it's a good move, right? It's a good move to make sure that businesses take this properly and invest in putting these measures in place if they need to. It's a lot of the requirements you've talked about, Mike, to me, ring of ISO 27001, 100%, and especially the new SOA controls they've introduced. A lot of them mirror what we're talking about here. So I guess if you're already compliant with ISO 27001,
you're going to meet a lot of these requirements already. There will be some elements perhaps on the NIST side of things that, what I mean when I talk about NIST is the incident response element side as well, which is what because the baseline covers a lot of both those areas. But 100% you're already on the way.
Yeah.
Because you'll have already defined your ISMS pack as well.
Yeah.
And you've already got those governance procedures and policies in place. And I dare say you've had to prove you are having those meetings you say you are.
Great. So let's see how does Microsoft security line up to these requirements. So we've also got the NIS principles. There's 14 of them on the left-hand side and solutions that can help. And we talked earlier about there's no real magic solution you can deploy that's going to meet all the requirements, because a lot of them are making sure you have the right process in place as well as the right technology in place. But you can see in the Microsoft security stack, a lot of businesses have Microsoft licensing. They'll have some level of Microsoft licensing. Hopefully you're aware of the security products that come with that Microsoft licensing. And there's a lot that can help. You just to call out one, you talked about building the culture of cybersecurity awareness, and there's a principle that covers staff awareness, and you talk about phishing simulation, right? And Defender for Office 365 can help with attack simulation and phishing simulation, and giving users training. There's going to be some things we can do around asset management. So there's Defender for Endpoint can help us identify all our assets. It can help us build that asset list.
Data security is a key one as well. I mean, your data is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And Microsoft have the Purview suite as well for that. So labeling or categorizing your files and all your data in your systems, and then label them effectively. And then once you've got the labels, then you can apply those data loss prevention policies, which leads into that insider risk management as well, and protect your team's communications, protect your emails, and protect all your shared files. So you've got a whole range of data security elements as well from Microsoft.
Yeah.
Not just the response side as well.
It's a really good point. And actually, with data security, that being one of the big changes between NIS1 and NIS2, there's a lot more requirements around data security. The Purview products are in loads of different Microsoft licenses. So you probably have access to some of that stuff already, and make sure you're using it. And then the last thing I want to call out before we move to the next slide is on C&D. So they introduce security monitoring, proactive security, response and recovery, and lessons learned. And that's where our services really fit nicely into those sections, right? We can help with making sure that you're monitoring 24/7 and you're monitoring all the right sources, making sure you have the right threat hunting going on, the right proactive security measures, managing that for you, and then obviously helping you with incident response and recovery to an extent, and then obviously doing the lessons learned and feeding that back into all your processes and procedures. So let's talk about the challenges of Objective CD. And we've talked about that. That's the area where we best fit in terms of our services, or MXDR services fit really well there. You now have this requirement to make sure you have monitoring, to make sure you do threat hunting, to make sure that you have the right measures in place if there is a breach. But there are challenges that come with that, and you've already called out a few of them. One of them is you need technical staff to do those things.
Yeah.
You need to
need the as well. You need enough staff.
Yes. So we talked about more than 90% of incidents, ransomware incidents, are happening outside of work hours. Do you have people in your business who are in place to respond to that if that happens outside of business hours? Does everyone understand what to do if there is a breach? Do you know who needs to be told? Do you know from a legal perspective or a compliance perspective what you need to do, as well as technically?
Yeah, it's that communication plan, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Who do we call in the event of a should we call in the event of this particular element, and go through those particular exercises, and how do you coordinate all of that as well?
Yeah, exactly. And threat hunting, I think, is a really important one. The other part of the C objective is the kind of proactive security event side of things. With threat hunting in our language, that's a really technical field. Yeah, it's a technical field that requires real skill, and I'd imagine a lot of businesses would find that really hard to do in-house.
Yeah,
it leads to outsourcing some of those security elements.
Yeah,
and I think we see more and more businesses do that, and that's in part why our services exist, right? We can help you with 24/7 coverage. We can help you with the incident response side of things, and we can help with all the threat hunting requirements that these kinds of directives introduce.
Absolutely.
So we kind of have a quick note on our services. Then we have three services. We have MDR for endpoints. That covers endpoint servers, identities.
Azure identities.
We enter identities, yeah. And then we have MXDR Advanced, which is basically the whole Microsoft stack. If you're an E5 customer, or maybe you're a business premium with some of the bolt-ons, we can cover all that in MXDR Advanced. Obviously, we can cover then email, servers, data, identity, networks. Yeah, all of that stuff. If it's built on a Microsoft product, that's kind of our specialism, and we can take it on and look after your organization holistically through those tools. And then MXDR Premium is probably our most common service. That's everything basically, extensive coverage, third parties included, as well as all the Microsoft security tooling.
Firewalls are key as well, and making sure we've got that coverage and visibility of the traffic in and out of the firewalls, which is key as well.
Yeah, but all of those services include threat hunting. Yeah. All of them include that 24/7 monitoring and response and containment actions if required. Yeah. So I think now we'll flip over to some of the questions, and we've got a little bit of time left.
4 minutes.
Amazing. We've actually got quite a few, so I'll just run through. I'll start at the beginning. Could you expand a bit more on the UK potentially adopting NIS2, please? What law has changed to make it easier, and can you see the UK following soon?
Yeah, so I think the UK government have said they're not going to adopt NIS2. So I don't think the UK has any intentions of adopting NIS2 as is. But they have, in 2022, I think, they made changes to what is NIS1 or what will be UK NIS1. They'll stick with the UK NIS1, but they're introducing new requirements, and they've introduced rules to basically say they can add new requirements. So I don't think it's impossible. The new requirements are basically managed service providers are in scope. There's more reporting requirements. There's more supply chain requirements that are basically what they've changed. It hasn't come into law yet, but it's already been approved to come into law. So we don't know when that will happen. But they have made it easier for them to change the requirements for UK NIS1 down the line. So I can imagine that if NIS2 are introducing stricter requirements, that the UK would do that by changing UK NIS1, right?
Yeah, and I would leave this as a question as a question back. Do you deal, or will you be dealing with in those particular sectors? Because if you are, then you perhaps may need to be NIS2 compliant in order to then deal with those companies in those sectors.
Yeah.
This one follows on quite nicely. Why isn't the UK going to align directly to NIS2?
It's a really good question. Yeah. I think because we don't have to, it's basically the answer, or like at least the answer that's come out of the government is that we're not in the European Union. We don't have to adopt NIS2.
I mean, this one's still already applied to the operational essential services, critical matter infrastructure, all those particular. So that's still happening, and that will change, and those will be tweaked. But is that going to be progressive for the rest of it? This is a good question, isn't it? And it's down to the UK government.
Yes, I guess it's whatever the UK government deems is the acceptable minimum requirement for cybersecurity for operators of essential services.
Written in text is they are going to be providing standards and requirements that we need to meet. Will it be exactly NIS2? It could well be a very, very. It could be the same version of it.
Yeah,
I personally think we're going to have to in the long run.
I think there'll be more changes to the UK NIS, but yeah, I don't think it will follow exactly NIS2.
What if my data is held in European data centres? So I'm assuming that's a UK company. Will I need to meet NIS2?
I would say so.
Well, I mean, the data center would definitely have to be NIS2 compliant.
And you didn't have to check as a person who's using that data center, because let's say for effectively that's part of your that's your risk to hold, because you're using a third party service. Then you've got to make sure that they are NIS2 compliant.
Brilliant. And how does this sit alongside GDPR?
Well, if we GDPR has been out since 2018, right? Yeah. so
as has NIS.
Yeah. So we are still going to have to always meet the GDPR regulations.
Yeah. There
is going to be some slight crossover, and there was crossover between the NIS-D or NIS1, should I say, and the GDPR. That always was, especially with the data protection, and of course the registering any breaches to the ICO and what have you. So GDPR doesn't change.
Yeah,
for us it doesn't. You still have to do what we have to do.
But GDPR is really around data protection, right? It's around your responsibilities for data and personally identifiable data, whereas NIS is more about how you should manage a business from a cybersecurity perspective, end to end, right? How you should.
I mean, as part of GDPR, it does specify you should have a business continuity plan or an incident response plan. Part of that, and of course, that's going to tie in really nicely, like I was saying. But no, ultimately, you have to still have to meet the GDPR requirements, no matter what.
Yeah.
Nice. You touched upon this earlier, but might be good just to recap. Do you have NIS2 if you have ISO 27001?
I don't think completely. I think you probably meet like 80+% of the requirements, I'd say, especially if you're following the latest 2022 statement of applicability, then those controls are really, really close to what NIS2 is asking. I think there'll be some slight differentiators. It's not completely aligned, but a lot of it will be covered in ISO 27001, and you certainly have the right structure in place.
Yeah, governance side of things as well.
Nice. Last one is more of a kind of sales question, I guess. Can Chorus assist with all 4 pillars of NIS2 objectives?
I'd say yes. Yeah, give me a call. I've lived this for 4.5, 5 years. First of all, make friends with your compliance officer.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we can do. Probably, yes, we can. Probably, definitely on B, C, and D. I think we can help massively. On A, which is kind of the asset management and all the policies and processes, we can advise. Yeah, we can help, but yeah, those things need to be mandated by the business or steered by the business. But yeah, we can support on the technology side and advise on everything else.
Amazing. That's all the questions we've got. Also conscious we've slightly overrun. Like I said, the recording and slides will be sent to everyone. If there were any questions that didn't get answered, or you've got any questions since watching this, feel free to just reply to the email with all the content and we'll get through. I'll send them on to MJ and Mike to answer for you. Thank you very much, both.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks, Mike.
No, thank you, Mark.